Evolution. Where's the beef? Where's the meat? I need to see the evidence for this stuff. I've been on sort of a creation high because there's just so much evidence against evolution. But I want to give you guys a chance to knock me off my creation high. So I'm welcoming anyone who wants to share evidence for or against evolution. So if you have evidence for evolution that you want to share, in about 5 minutes, I'll let you join the stream. There's a few things I have to talk about first. But yes, my husband says that I've been on such a creation high. He's like, I think you need to grind up some dinosaur bones and snort them just to get, really in the mood, I guess. But anyway, so I want to review the talk from last week when I had you guys join the stream and share the evidence for evolution. So we actually did have our first points awarded for evolution, the evolution side last week. So I want to give credit to Grayson for that. And let's just talk about what we found from last week. So Grayson, I gave him 2 points on the evolution side last week. And those were both for predictions of maybe what we would call transitional forms. And so those are Tiktaalik and Archaeopteryx. So what Grayson said is, look, we thought that we would find these transitional forms. Evolutionists predicted that they would find these transitional forms. And then we went out and we actually found them. So I would say that's a point toward evolution. Now, on the design side, I presented evidence from a peer-reviewed paper called Evolutionary Biology is Dead in Darwin's Warm Little Pond. And it talks about the co-origination problem related to enzymes. And no one has contradicted that. So that still stands as a point against evolution. And Sal came on and he talked about nuclear pore complexes, the code changes, the problem with that. And no one was able to bring anything against that. So that stands as a point for the design side. Now, I wanted to just talk a minute about the Tiktaalik for those who are not familiar with Tiktaalik. So Tiktaalik has some features that one could consider transitional between a fish and an amphibian. So this was what Neil Shubin sought to find when he went out. And by the way, I found and he went out and him and his team found the Tiktaalik fossil, which had a few features that do look like it could be a transitional form to amphibian. Now, whether it is or not, we'll just say, okay, I don't know, but what I can say is that was a successful prediction. They predicted they would find something like that, and they did find it. Anyway, I found a great talk by Neil Shubin, and I linked it in the description. He talks about going out to find this. And I want to just say that Dr. Dan actually recommended this book to me a while ago, Your Inner Fish. And it's the same guy, Neil Shubin, who wrote this book, and he's a really excellent communicator. I think this is the best book I've read on evolution. So I recommend this both to evolutionists and creationists because I think he's a really good writer, and he's presented the evidence well. And I actually think that depending on what lens you read this through, you could see a lot of evidence for creation in this book. But I also think he does a good job of just telling the science. So I recommend that book. And thank you, Dr. Dan, for recommending that to me. I've given this book out to a bunch of people. So anyway, I gave Grayson and the evolution side, the points for Tiktaalik and Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx is a bird that has some features that could be considered transitional, like claws on the wings. Even though we have birds with claws on the wings, we have at least one bird with claw on the wings alive today. But there's some other features like the tail that could be considered as a transitional form. So, I'm happy to give those points to evolution. Now, I will say Grayson also presented this chart, if you remember. So I want to talk a little bit about this chart because he presented this as evidence. And I would say I awarded him a point against young Earth for this. Okay. So I can't call this evidence for evolution, but I can call this a point against young Earth. So, and really, I'm trying to consider the evidence for evolution in these streams. But since I am a young Earth creationist, I also do allow people to present stuff that would be anti my specific view. But keep in mind that young Earth could be false and evolution could still be false. So bringing evidence against young Earth is not actually evidence in favor of evolution. But the specific point that I'm awarding him against young Earth is, he said, the lack of metamorphosis in insects in the lowest insects that go through metamorphosis in the lowest fossil layers. So if you remember, he showed this chart, and if you look on the brown side, where they find the insects the lowest, those would be insects that don't go through metamorphosis. And it is a little strange that in this span of time, that on the evolutionary time scale is like 100 million years, we find one type of insect, but we don't find all these other types of insects, the ones that go through partial metamorphosis and then the ones that go through full metamorphosis. So I do think that's a little bit strange from a young earthy perspective. Like, why wouldn't we find all these insects at all layers? So I award that as a point against young earth creation. But I also want to say that I thought about the points that Grayson was trying to make for evolution, and I do not consider this evidence for evolution. So one thing Grayson mentioned was that, hey, look, it looks like we're seeing a progression to metamorphosis here, because, basically we've got in the lowest layer, we've got the insects that don't go through metamorphosis. Then we've got insects that go through partial metamorphosis. And then we've got insects that go through full metamorphosis. And I thought, okay, is this really evidence for evolution? And I would say it's not, because if we reversed it, let's just say instead of finding those insects on the left, what if we found the metamorphosis ones on the bottom and the other insects on the, at later in the layers? Well, then evolutionists could just say, well, you see, these insects used to have to go through metamorphosis, and then they stopped having to go through metamorphosis. So that shows evolutionary progress. See, it was a lot harder for them to get to the adult stage. Now it's easier for them. So I was trying to think, is this really evidence for evolution? Did anyone specifically say, look, in evolution, we would predict that insects wouldn't have to go through metamorphosis, but then they would evolve this complex system of metamorphosis where they actually have to commit suicide in a chrysalis and to be able to get to their adult stage. I don't think that anyone predicted that, but if I'm wrong, I'm open to be shown that I'm wrong. So show me, but I can't count this as evidence for evolution, especially because what I see on this chart is separate ancestry. Now, I see a lot of lines that are supposed to be connecting these creatures at the bottom, but I don't see any transitional forms connecting these creatures. So I don't see the millions of years of transitional forms that I would expect to see if this were true. And in fact, my evidence against evolution for today is from that same paper that Grayson brought up. So he just used the chart from the paper, but I went ahead and read the whole paper to see what it says about the evolution of insect metamorphosis. Now, as usual, when I find papers that talk about the evolution of such and such, let me tell you what usually happens in these papers, because there's usually no evidence for evolution of whatever it's describing. And that is very true with this paper. Okay. So what it does is it's very at length, it describes processes within these different types of insects. So it's very good at presenting what is actually true about reality, the processes, the genes, the description of reality. So, and a lot of times this happens in stuff related to evolution. There's sort of a little trick, and I'm not saying it's an intentional trick, but it's like, there's like a presentation of scientific facts, but then you're supposed to believe the story that this evolved. So this was a great presentation of facts about insects that go through metamorphosis. But as usual, when it gets to the details of trying to figure out how these transitions could have taken place, then there's a lot of, well, we don't really know. Well, we think this happened. Well, and it's storytelling. Okay. And usually they are honest enough to admit that there's problems and conflicts even with their storytelling. So I'm going to just give an example from the conclusion of this thing about metamorphosis. It says there has been continuing controversy over how the nymphal and adult stages of hemimetabolous forms evolved into the larval, pupal, and adult stages of holometabola. Broad and E93 provide important insights into this controversy, but on first sight, they lead to somewhat conflicting conclusions. Okay, so after looking at the genes, which Broad and E93 are genes that are involved in the metamorphosis, so they come to conflicting conclusions. In other words, they don't know how this happened. There's no evidence presented that we actually evolved, that insects actually evolved metamorphosis. Okay, so there's no evidence in this paper of how these creatures evolved. There's a description of reality. There's description of various genes involved in the process, but I want to present this as evidence against evolution, because in a paper that is supposed to be telling me how insects evolved metamorphosis, I mean, that's the title of the paper, right? But there's no trace of evidence that these insects actually evolved in that way. So that's my evidence against evolution. Anybody's welcome to come on and argue with me about it. And so now I'll just give you guys the opportunity to join the stream if you want to, and just share your evidence for evolution if you've got some. And by the way, this will be my last open stream for a month because I'm going out of town, and I'm going next week to the Layers of Faith Creationist Conference in Denver. So if you want to come and hug me or shoot me, that's where I'll be. So you're welcome. And then after that, I have to go somewhere else for 3 weeks. So this will be the last time that I'll be having an open stream sharing evidence for allowing people to share evidence for evolution for 1 month. But if you share evidence today, then when I come back in a month, that's when I'll respond to whatever evidence you presented. So, okay, let's see what's going on in the chat. And if anybody wants to join the stream, you're welcome. All right. Zing. Wow, Zing is old school. Zing, remember how we talked about like evolution 4 years ago? Good to see you. So Zing says, if evolution is false, how come we look similar to chimpanzees and gorillas? Well, the old monkey look kind of like a person argument. Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, there's lots of different creatures, and there's lots of creatures that look similar to each other. And I admit there's some similarities between us and chimpanzees and gorillas, but like our old pal Kent Hovind used to say, he would make the joke that like, do you want to marry a chimpanzee? If you don't, then that's obviously they're not as similar to you as you're presenting it. So how you doing, Sal? Are
How are
you
you?
what's going on?
Uh, yeah, I
Uh
figured that helped the
Okay.
evolutionists
Oh,
out, and
I
also
can't hear you. Sorry, I don't have my headphones in. Okay, there we go. How you doing?
I figured I'd practice my uh, imitation evolutionist. I don't think I'll last but a few minutes because I'm too honest.
Oh, really?
but 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 there is something important here. I'm convinced that it would be good for creationists to teach evolution. They have to learn it well enough to teach it, and so I'm going to have to do that. And some of the most successful, there was a case where Richard Lumsden said, I'll never teach. He was an atheist, became a creationist, and he said, I'll never teach evolution again. And then he changed his mind. He said, no, I have to be able to teach evolution so that I could criticize it. So I'm not going to do a very good job of representing evolution because you're going to see, you'll know what's in my head. So I don't
Okay,
even know
great.
how to begin.
Okay, well, you said you wanted to present the evidence for evolution. So go ahead, present what you feel is evidence for evolution.
We practically have the same DNA code, minus a few anomalies. I mean, we have similar genes. A lot of there's cytochrome C that is uh, conserved across all domains of life. That is such proof of evolution.
Well, what percentage of similarity would you say is in our DNA? Because there's been a lot of controversy about this lately with the numbers, whether it's 98%, 84%. So
Well,
what?
we can establish a homolog even with 12%. Even if the sequences aren't similar, we've shown that there is a lot of fold similarity. So when you put this through X-ray crystallography, that's how we're able to identify it. Plus, we run it through BLAST databases that are able to establish that the patterns are non-random. So the best explanation has to be inheritance. The definition of evolution is descent with heritable modification. And so this is proof of evolution. Anytime you can establish similarity and heritable modification that's consistent with it, that's evolution. That's the proof of evolution right there.
Okay, well, I would say that similarities do not say that there is a common ancestor. So we can have similarities. And in fact, we would expect similarities in the genes because we have some morphological similarities. But, when we're talking about how many, basically base pairs in our DNA is like 3 billion. And if we're saying 85% of those are shared with chimps, we're talking about like, I mean, I don't have the math in front of me. I'm sorry, I'm really bad at math, but wouldn't it be like 500 million base pairs difference?
I haven't done the math. It would be a lot.
Okay. Okay.
Well, look, the thing that, the counter has been that this is common design. And, the problem with the common design argument is you have errors like an interferon 3,4 lambda. I actually studied this at the National Institutes of Health under a honest to Darwin evolutionary biologist who was the staff worker Coonan. And I looked at this and it's like, yeah, that looks like a shared error by common descent. We had gorillas and humans have this interferon lambda. It was right there at the intersection of where the introns meet. And that looked just so much like common descent. So why would a designer make common design where there are common shared errors like that? So this is proof of evolution for sure.
Now, wait, how do we know that's a shared error? Like, what is the evidence that it's a shared error?
first it is at the same gene.
Right. No, I'm saying,
And
okay, we noticed it's this, we noticed that there is something, but
right
how do we know that it's an error?
here. Oh, okay, good. Because sometimes there are a few humans that don't have that error.
Okay.
And they're able to develop immunity that, to things like colds that no one else. And we were able to track it down exactly to, when they had a spontaneous mutation, you only need one, and it restored the reading frame and the gene started to work. So, I mean, that was really amazing. I mean, that would, that would give every creationist, even Salvador Cordova, a pause.
Wait a minute, but if you're saying there's some humans who don't have the error, then that tells me the error entered after the supposed split between the primates and the humans.
Well, you may have good points there, but I was just throwing out what I thought would be the best evidence. I mean, if I were a card-carrying creationist, that would definitely cause me pause.
No, but I mean, do you agree with what I'm saying? Like, do you agree that I'm making a good point here? I mean, are you is that true that some humans don't have that?
Yes, that is true.
Okay, so that means that it wasn't an error that was introduced in the common ancestry, if there was such a thing, between primates and humans. It had to be introduced after, if some humans don't have it.
It's kind of hard to explain, but we do see. Okay, so you have introns and exons to make you have the non-coding part of a gene, which is the intron, and then you have these exons that I don't know if that's relevant or not, but it just looks. This is how we were able to identify it. This missing part disables the function of the gene. So we gain immunity when some humans, for whatever reason, spontaneously get the right mutation in the right spot, and then suddenly they're able to fight colds better than anyone else.
Okay, so this is not a common ancestry argument then. It's an argument about the power of mutation.
No, it is. It's like, well, why would the other creatures like chimpanzees have that same broken gene? And presumably if we flip that little spot that looks like an error, they'll start gaining immunity to colds just like humans. Now, I don't know for a fact whether we've actually done experiments like that. So you keep hearing about pseudogenes being evidence of common ancestry, the idea that, pseudogenes are broken genes, and we share lots of broken genes with other creatures. That's my best example. Interferon 3 lambda.
Okay, interferon 3 lambda. Okay, but I need a little bit of clarification, Sal, on
Sure.
how this is actually evidence for evolution. Like, which thing is evidence for evolution? The fact that error exists, the fact that gene exists. I'm not following.
So the first level is to say we share the gene.
Okay.
And so we would say, well, outside of common design, that would be the best explanation. I don't know if that's clear.
And I mean, like I said, I expect shared genes in in design. I expect shared genes because I don't think God has to reinvent each like he doesn't have to reinvent a new sequence for everything he wants to do, right? It actually makes more sense that he would use the same code for the similar feature.
So the problem is, what happens then if God would use the same, or the designer would use the same gene, for same functions? Why then would we all share the same broken genes?
But okay, here's where I'm not understanding how this is. Are you saying this is evidence for common ancestry? Because
if I could clarify.
Okay.
So there's if there's similarity, the decision point is it common design or common descent? I mean, there are two possibilities to explain the similarity: common design or common descent.
Right. But what I'm saying is, you already told me that some humans don't have the error.
That's correct.
Okay. So my point, and this is what I'm trying to get you to respond to, is if like this is being presented as, hey, we had the common error because we were once common, we had a common ancestor with the primates, and that's where the common error came from, then we wouldn't see some humans having the error and some humans not having the error. Because if the error was introduced in the primate, in the common ancestor lineage, then that means all humans would have the error.
Well, then what you have said would open the possibility that this is a mutational hotspot.
And that's what I was trying to get to.
Oh,
so,
see, I knew I wouldn't. I told you I wouldn't last long.
But I wanted you to. I wanted to. That's a possibility. But that's what I wanted to show, is that if some humans don't have it, that means it did not happen in the lineage of our supposed common ancestry.
Okay,
I mean, do you agree to that, or is there?
Well, let me get out of my evolution mode, because I can only do that for so long. I do have to tell you, when I saw that, it gave me a lot of pause, and I asked around. I said, "This is pretty incriminating," and there are a lot of pseudogenes, and even now, like when we're watching live experimental evolution, and a gene is disabled in an individual, it becomes a pseudogene. And so it is very troubling to see shared errors. But, a mutational hotspot or an inclination for even the same nucleotide to be blown out, that is a compelling possibility. There's a lot about genetic change. There is definitely some that is random, and then some it's like, well, we just don't quite know. It's a leap, but I have to tell you, when I was studying that, and I said, look, I still believe in intelligent design, but this would blow away. This would be a problem for young Earth. You could still have intelligent design plus evolution, like Michael Behe believes, because some of the proteins. But so if we're talking evolution as far as common descent, there are a lot of ID proponents, including Michael Behe, still believe in common descent. And I think that was one of them. So if you define evolution as common descent, it's like, well, look, even Michael Behe believes in common descent, so evolution's true.
Well, you know what? Actually, I have a friend that asked me, like, does it give you pause that Michael Behe has accepted common ancestry? And I said, I cannot understand that. So far, I have not seen where I adore Michael Behe, okay, but I cannot understand where he's coming from in embracing common ancestry. Now, you said this bothered you when you saw it.
Does. It's okay.
But why? I mean, in 2 minutes, I told you why it's not a problem, like why it cannot be proof or evidence for common ancestry. So what's the pushback? Why is it still a problem?
Well, let's put it this way. I'm going to feel more comfortable if someone can establish, as you said, that is a mutational hotspot, just for that instance. I'm going to just feel better. Okay, put it that way.
But it does establish it. It already does establish it if some humans do not have that mutation.
I'll have to think on it, okay?
Okay, that's what I'm saying. To me, it's destroyed.
I'm on your side, but okay. So I'm not trying to. I'm sincerely saying this has bothered me. So if they say, Sal, do you have any reservations? I'm like, that would be it.
I know. And see, to me, I feel like I just solved it for you. But I mean, if you need to think about it, because to me, like, you already answered the question. You already answered it when you said some humans don't have the error. Now, if that was a mistake, like, are you sure about that? Do some humans have, like, are you sure about that statement? Because that could change
Oh,
everything.
yes. This is actually how they discovered it.
Okay.
Like a lot of things, they were searching for one thing, found something else by accident, so to speak. They were wondering why some humans were more prone to colds than others. And they were just exchanging. They're saying, hey, well, look, we found this little nucleotide that just flipped and enabled, in the humans that had this enhanced immunity, the gene was enabled. For those who are technical, the premature stop codon was removed, and the introns were able to function nicely. So that's maybe neither here nor there. But yes, short answer. I'm sorry to be long-winded. I'll try to be more succinct.
No, I'm
Short answer,
trying
yes.
to follow.
Yes,
I'm
it is
trying to
confirmed.
follow.
Okay, a simple yes would have sufficed. I apologize for being long-winded. You know me.
No, so you're sure that it is true. Some humans have it and some humans don't.
Yeah.
Okay, then that ends. There is where the common ancestry evidence ends. It's not common ancestry. It has to be a mutational hotspot or some other explanation. Maybe it's gene regulatory network explanation. Maybe in some people, the gene regulatory network acts upon in such a way to bring about that immunity in a greater way, and in others it doesn't. So there could be multiple explanations, one of them being the possible hotspots. But one thing that's absolutely ruled out is that this is evidence for common ancestry. That's ruled out. If some humans have it and some humans don't, that shows humans did not get this from common ancestry with primates.
Okay, so I'm going to go back in evolution.
You got to think on it. Okay.
But similarity. You need to have a design. If we don't have evidence if we don't see the designer, we can't believe there's a designer. So the default is common descent, not common design.
Okay, well, that's not my default. But Wesley Coleman says he dropped out. He said, are we talking about a pseudogene? Yes. What was the name of it again, Sal?
Interferon 3,4 lambda. I might try to look it up at some point. And
yeah, and thank you guys for being in the chat. I want to just pull up a few comments. Philip says, why would we expect shared genes from an omniscient, omnipotent common designer who could just as easily create two genera with two completely unique genetic codes? Now, I mean, there's no way to give an answer to this about why God did something, okay? So, I mean, I can give an idea about why God did it that way, but this is just basically assuming that we could get into the mind of God. So, but I will try, because for me, it absolutely makes sense that even though God could easily create two completely different genetic codes, why should he? Like, I mean, that would actually make science harder for us, right? If we it makes science easier that we might share a gene with a fruit fly, and if we manipulate that gene, we can find out what is going on, what might be possible with humans. So it definitely makes science easier that things are more consistent. So that's just one idea. But I don't like to get into why God did this or that. We're trying to stay on the evidence, scientific evidence, right? So the 1-star reviews of God's creation, you guys go put that on Amazon. But the right now, I just like to talk about the scientific evidence for or against evolution, because, hey, if evolution happened, we should be seeing a lot of evidence for it. I'm asking, where's the beef? Because I don't see it. That's why I'm on my creationist high. That's why I'm jumping around my house like, woohoo, woohoo, and, just having such a blast, because nobody can bring it. I'm still waiting for somebody to bring it. All right, go ahead, Sal.
So I found one of the studies. It lists it as interferon lambda 4. Sometimes it's 3,4. Interferon lambda 4 pseudogenes. It says here the gene is a polymorphic pseudogene, which in some humans encodes the interferon lambda protein. And there's some technicalities here. And compared to the ancestral state of non-human primates, and it talks about that. So I'm just going to leave it at that. I don't want to get into technicalities, but I just wanted to confirm, yes. And this was a mystery how some humans had, it seemed like, super immunity, so to speak. And so for some of them, they have it, but they classify this as a pseudogene. Now, I got to credit you with something. That is kind of amazing that there's some humans that are really doing this well. So this suggests it's also possible they had a working gene and then it became a pseudogene. And then it's breaking in other creatures. For some, I have said, okay, I'm putting on my creationist hat now, that it does look like, despite all the design, the fabulous design we have in nature, that there were almost deliberate breaks. Like the world's under judgment. I mean, okay, you don't have, that's very theological, but you can't run away from the fact, there almost looks like there's deliberate breaks across all designs. Like kind of the passage of, now the gardens will grow thorns and thistles and all these things. I just kind of see it. You don't, that's very theological, but to me, that's what if we reject common descent, I'm willing to accept common breakage,
Yeah. Well, I also want to say I totally agree with Wesley's comment here. And I was just about to actually say something about this, because he says pseudogene is already a highly loaded term with evolutionary assumption, hidden or clear. It's an assumption of homology being evidence of ancestry from the outset. Okay, I don't understand the second sentence here, but what I was going to say is I object to the term pseudogene. I think it's very arrogant that we have given names to these things, endogenous retroviruses, that assumes where this came from. Pseudogenes. It assumes something about the gene. The code is such a mystery to us still, to label something as a pseudogene just because you can't right now look and see what its function is. Doesn't mean it doesn't have a function, doesn't mean it's broken. We've been showing that the gene regulatory networks, it is controlling what gets expressed and what doesn't. And sometimes genes are turned off. And so, this could be an example of, okay, a gene regulatory network kicks in and it makes the person have an immune response for colds. Maybe it's based on what kind of environment they're in. I mean, so I don't know. I object to the term pseudogene. I don't understand his second sentence. Do you understand how this is an assumption of homology?
Okay, it assumes if it's similar, therefore it descended from a common ancestor. And Wesley, homology means similarity. Actually,
yes. But how is pseudogene? Are they saying like, oh, these used to be when we had these ancestors, we used to use these genes, but then they basically they're no longer used, but we're still carrying them from our common ancestry in our genomes? Is that why he's saying that?
okay, this is my take, and I'm just realizing it now. It's a subtle dig at the common design argument, because you have common design and versus common descent, and this is the overriding theme. Why would again, it's more of this rhetorical thing. Why would a designer deliberately make errors across all species? And I say, well, designers, one, can do that, but they'll, people say, well, that doesn't make sense. That's just an ad hoc apology. But the other, as you pointed out, it could be functional, or the creatures could simultaneously have developed these pseudogenes, and they could be pseudogenes, but if they're functional, they're not really pseudogenes. And I happen to know, when I was at the NIH, my first class was on microRNAs. They said, we found out some of these things we call pseudogenes are probably important for regulation, because the RNA serves as kind of an RNA sponge or interference, and microRNAs emerge from these. So, we can't really tell, as you said, and as Wesley pointed out, whether it had function, whether it is a gene that was disabled, or that there's a reason it looks like a gene, and that's rather important, because it has to look like that gene for the RNA interference to work in a regulatory circuit. It just has to be off enough to act as what they call a sponge. So, there are legitimate pseudogenes, because we see them disabled, like in Lenski's experiment, we had all sorts of broken genes in Lenski's. Those were pseudogenes. So it is hard to tell, and it's prejudicial to call everything that doesn't look like a full-blown gene a pseudogene. It could be a regulatory sequence that we're mistaking as a broken gene. It probably could have been designed that way.
Yeah. Now, Lunatic 963 says, are you saying there is no scientific evidence for evolution? I'm not saying that. I'm waiting for the evidence. That's what I'm saying. I'm waiting for the evidence. So I read a lot about evolution. Now, I forget a lot of what I read, but let me just say I haven't encountered really anything that I would say is good evidence for evolution. So that's one of the reasons I'm doing these streams. I want to know what is the best evidence for evolution. So that's what I'm waiting for. Sal, do you have a different answer to that?
No, I've given it to you. And as a card carrying, I was evolutionist, then old Earth creationist, young Earth creationist. The thing that has bothered me the most is our similarity to chimpanzees. It was only like in the last 7 years I began to get over it. And part of it, unfortunately, is because creationists kept saying we're so different from chimpanzees. I'm going to give a different take. I'm going to insist that we're very similar to chimpanzees. So everything that Erica Gutzig-Gibbon might say about our similarity, I actually, for the most part, am willing to grant that. But I began to look at it differently when I started to see how they investigated human biology. The way they did a lot of human biology research was to work on mice and chimps. And if you saw all the cruel experiments we did on those innocent creatures, you'd be grateful God made us so similar to the chimpanzees and mice, and that there's this nested hierarchy and this transitional progression from simple to more complex all the way up to humans. You'd be so grateful every day that you don't have to be subject to all the cruel experiments. I mean, they took these mice, let them go in a maze, and they said, we want to figure out what happened in their brains. So they let them play in a maze for 6 hours, and they said, well, let's examine their brains. So they chopped out the mice's head and started examining the brains. I know that sounds so gross, but there's a Christian theme here. These innocent creatures died on our behalf so we could be healed. Doesn't that sound like a Christian theme?
That's beautiful. That's beautiful, Sal. Although I'm not it also sounds cruel. Like I'm not sure that was the right thing for us to do. But anyway, but I like that take on it. But I just want to offer a different perspective, because look, I was obsessed. I loved animals when I was a kid, and I especially loved chimpanzees. My two favorite movies, well, not my two favorite, I had other favorites, but two movies that I really loved when I was a kid were Project X with Matthew Broderick and the chimpanzees, and Gorillas in the Mist with Sigourney Weaver. Okay, so, but you know what? In my love of gorillas and chimpanzees, it never once occurred to me to think that they looked like me. Not at all. I never, that thought is, to me, I don't find that to be very compelling. I don't really see the, okay, we look so much alike. These are clearly animals. I don't see any human being that resembles these animals. I mean, we have some morphological features that are the same, but we're very different. And so, I mean, I don't see it.
Okay, so I just have to share this with you. Okay, so me as a card-carrying creationist, it bothered me severely.
Yeah, I understand.
Some creationists are going to be way more affected than others. So this definitely bothered me. And for what it's worth, the author of Evolution, a Theory in Crisis, he used to be a creationist. Then he went full atheist Darwinian. That was Michael Denton.
Michael Denton, I read his book 20 years ago.
Okay, so he went from creationist all the way to atheist, but then came back half circle. He became an agnostic and then a critic of evolutionary theory. So, and then
I recently read a book by him. It was like Evolution Still a Theory in Crisis.
Right.
Yeah.
So the reason I'm sharing that with you is I find him to be a very beautiful voice, kind of in between creationists and evolutionists, because he's been through the whole thing, and he criticizes both sides, which is also compelling. So if you want kind of like someone who's kind of in the middle, who feels free to criticize both sides, that's a good book. But there was an incident there that he shared. He said when he went off to medical school, he started dissecting. They put him, part of his medical training was to dissect primates, dead primates. So he could, they'll either work on human cadavers or primates. And when he started taking apart the primates, he said, he became an atheist. He said, they look so much like us. So maybe to your eye, they don't look that similar. To his eye, that made him an atheist. And given that he wrote the book, Evolution, a Theory in Crisis, I'm accepting that, okay, I'm not saying it's necessarily factual, but it had a powerful effect on him. It had a powerful effect on me. So I personally...
No, I know. Actually, that's what Jeremy says. He's like, the only thing that where the power is on evolution is monkey look kind of like a person. That's it. That's like where he thinks that's the strength of it, right? Yeah. And other than that, there's nothing. So I mean, I realize that's compelling for a lot of people. It's not for me, but I mean, I understand that for some people, seeing those similarities would.
And I know an ID proponent, Mike Jean. This was like 15 years ago. He was very popular in ID circles. He still is. He has still a following. But he said he was kind of he was just a young kid. Probably didn't have a lot of set views. Then he became a creationist, and then he began to believe in evolution, but then came back to ID. So his story is a little bit like Michael Denton. And he said, well, why would God make creatures like chimpanzees that look so much like us? I'm not saying his argument is right, but I am saying I can empathize at an emotional level. That similarity was enough to make him, he still believes in God and still an intelligent designer, but he thinks common descent he's like Michael Behe, so I
don't understand it. Do you know what is it? Is it this argument that Michael Behe finds compelling? What is it that's causing Michael Behe to accept common ancestry?
Okay, I think he listed it in one of his books, and I apologize. And one of his more recent ones, not just Darwin's Black Box. Okay. And he said, well, I think he mentioned pseudogenes. I think pseudogenes are very compelling to him and these shared, quote unquote, shared errors. But I think he's said this publicly. He said, that's not my argument. My argument is against randomness versus design. He said,
that's what I wondered.
He said, if there is, he said, I'm not going to argue. I said, if there's no common ancestry, that's fine too with me. That's just not my focus. So I'm accepting that he's not like a strong proponent of either view. He's like, well, I don't care. I'm satisfied that there's design. That's all that really matters to me.
And that's what I wondered, because I read his book, Darwin Devolves, which is a really great book, by the way. And I realized the power in what he's doing with he embraces the evolutionary timeline, and he embraces common ancestry, and then he makes his arguments against evolution based on, based on the irreducible complexity. I know that's a hot button phrase now, that but basically he makes his arguments. There is power in like accepting the frameworks in order to make your argument against the thing. So that's what I was wondering if he was doing. Just, not trying not to get into a bigger argument about all of this stuff, but just to focus his arguments.
Well, I mean, if I could share, sometimes it's like he echoes a lot of my own personal. I mean, I'm a doubting Thomas. I'm just not.
I know.
It's in my nature to just like be skeptical of even my own beliefs and think, gee, have I gotten this totally wrong? I mean, you can't be a good engineer or scientist unless you have some level of like self-doubt and questioning and revisiting. And it's like, I need a certain level of reassurance. I mean, I for the most part believe it. I just want some more reassurance. And so I'm just echoing, there are people on our side who are sympathetic, but they would be like me. It's like, I'd feel better if I got a little bit more better answers. I will say this, one reason I've persisted is as the data has, I've been watching this unfold for 40 years. The data has gotten, remember that little chart I made that you begged me to, and I'm looking for it, where I said, look, it was all red here, but now some of the things are starting to turn green.
Yeah.
Over time. I mean, even in the last 10 years, stuff that we really needed has kind of come out. So, I'm getting to the point, it's like, yeah, Sal, I may have doubts, but they start to kind of be healed slowly just because the data is coming in. But I'd say the nested hierarchy, which I do accept is real. I see it in gene sequencing.
Whoa.
Let's argue about that. Okay, no, let's argue about that.
I know. Let's argue about that, because let me tell you why it's totally bogus. Okay. And I'm fine if somebody with more training wants to come on and tell me why I'm wrong. Great. I welcome you. The link is right there. Okay. But nested hierarchy, what are we talking about? First of all, we're just grouping animals together by similarities. Okay. So there's no common ancestry assumed in grouping animals together by similarities. But the reason that I would say nested hierarchy is it's actually very problematic for evolution. And that's because these nested hierarchies are unresolved. And in everything that I've looked into, every phylogeny that I've looked into, and I haven't looked into 100, okay? Let's say I've looked into 15, okay? That's probably a good estimate. Every time I read a paper that's talking about the evolution of such and such, the phylogenetic tree is a mess, okay? They can't figure out how to resolve these things. If they do it based on one trait, then it falls apart with regard to other traits. So they have to choose. And you could choose it based on a certain trait or another trait, and then you've got to explain why it doesn't fit in this other way. And you can do it by morphology in a variety of ways. You could do it by genetics, which is a lot of what they're doing right now, and the genetics don't fit either. And then you've got other things like one of your favorites, the proteins, right? If you have different proteins in different types of animals that are supposed to be on the same tree, but their proteins don't match up, that also doesn't make sense. So the phylogenetic trees are an absolute mess. That is not what we would expect for common ancestry. We would expect one tree that makes great sense genetically, morphologically, proteins, everything that you could possibly do. But instead, every single tree is a mess. And then whenever something doesn't fit, they just make up a word to patch it up. Oh, that's what we call convergent evolution. Oh, really? How interesting. In fact, just the paper I was reading with the insect metamorphosis, you know what they're calling this? So if it's lineage that's close together, they call it parallel evolution. So you've got two insects that they've grouped together, but whatever trait it is, they're saying, wait, this is genetically different. This is genetically different. So it had to evolve separately, parallel. And it's such a mess. So what I'm saying is, how is nested hierarchy evidence? Give me the evidence. Let me see it. I don't see this.
Okay. So the first thing is where I'm on your side, but I know make a different.
I know. I want you to be hard on it. I want you to be hard on the idea, Sal. I want to push. Let's push it. Let's see the best evidence evolution can give. Give it to me.
So so I have published on this, Oxford University Press. So this is reputable. And when we did multiple sequence alignments, by the way, I got to say, my lead author, Joe DeWeese, he just got published by Springer Nature, a magnum opus book. He's now a recognized expert. And I got to be one of his co-authors. He's also a young earth creationist, but he's now a recognized expert in enzymology in topoisomerases. So I'm going to speak about the topoisomerase here. So I'm just saying I know topoisomerase, all right? So.
Okay, wait, before you launch into it, let me just bring up this comment by DBK, because I just want to address this before we go on. DBK says, but Rebekah, you acknowledge you certainly don't understand the material, like someone who's gotten a degree in evolutionary science, right? Yes, I agree. I don't understand the material like someone who's gotten a degree in evolutionary science. But whenever I inquire, whenever I read, whenever I look into something myself, I find that the evidence is actually against evolution. So some people are content to allow others to do their critical thinking for them, to allow people who have a degree in that area to decide what they should believe about it. And I'm not content on something that has this much of an impact in the world. What I believe about origins is extremely important, and I'm willing to take the time to look into it. Now, not everybody is, and that's fine. For other people, that might not be an important issue, but for me, it is. So no, I don't know everything that an evolutionary biologist knows, but that doesn't mean I'm just going to believe whatever they say, especially when I'm reading their writings and I'm noticing that they actually, when they call it evolution of insect metamorphosis, guess what they don't talk about in here? Evolution of insect metamorphosis. There's no evidence presented for evolution of insect metamorphosis. All that this does is describe reality. It describes different genes that are in insects, what those genes do, da, 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 da. And then when it gets to talking about the evolution, it starts saying, whoa, we have all these conflicts. We have a controversy. We have a challenge. Yeah. So what you're telling me is there's no evidence for insect metamorphosis. Thank you. So I'm happy to be corrected on that. That's why I'm doing this. If anybody wants to come in and correct me on insect metamorphosis, please show me the evidence for insect metamorphosis. Okay, Sal, I'm ready.
Okay, so, and you touched upon this. When you do an isolated protein, you get a beautiful nested hierarchy. So I collected for some papers that we did. I collected data from the anyone can do this. The topoisomerase 2 alpha in humans, chimpanzees. What else did we do? We did Arabidopsis thaliana, which is a plant, yeast. We grabbed mouse and rabbit, and we just put it through a machine and said, okay, group all the ones that are most similar, and then just draw it up in terms of similarity and dissimilarity, and it made this beautiful tree that kind of looks like, oh, chimps and humans. In fact, I've seen this where there are in another protein, the human and chimp protein / gene, 100% identical. And in this case, the topoisomerases were really, really close between that. And it built this nice nested hierarchy. Now, you pointed out the problem, rightly so, that if you take another protein, you might get a different tree that doesn't put them all together. And I put this to Dr. Dan, and he had a good counter. The guy could play poker, seriously. If he doesn't have a good hand, I would melt. That's why I was a blackjack player. But the guy can just say, oh, that's not a problem. And whereas it would really bother me if I was confronted. He said, oh, it's incomplete lineage sorting. Do you understand that? That's adaptive radiation. That's why it's not like this. And it's like, okay,
Oh, wait, I've got to write that down. Adaptive radiation. I like to collect the words that patch up the evolutionary problem.
The rescue mechanisms.
Yes.
If I showed him, let me see if I've got to find this.
Adaptive radiation. Okay, I'm going to look into that. That sounds fun.
Lineage sorting. And I had this diagram that showed and I wish I remembered the name of it. I can't believe that.
Okay, you can look it up right now because there's other comments that came in. So I'll answer comments while you're looking it up. Okay. So, yeah, this is so fun, by the way. I'm having a great time. And I'm sorry if I'm not getting to all the comments because there's other ones. So, DBK says, Rebekah, ever wonder why people not raised around Abrahamic religion never see intelligent design in nature like people who believe creationist mythology? No, I actually think that a lot of people do see intelligent design in nature. But, no, I don't. I'm not sure that you're correct about this. Okay, Philip says, Rebekah, I presume you allow for microevolution within certain groups of animals, say all canids. If so, what criteria do you use to include or exclude other creatures from canidae? I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but what criteria do I use? I'm not really worried about, which criteria I use. I do, except I would even say, I don't like to use the terms micro and macro evolution because people have told me there's a specific definition of that. And, so I don't want to rule out something that's macro evolution. I do believe that animals can speciate. So if they can no longer reproduce, maybe that's our definition of speciation. And so I definitely think that can happen. It has happened. So what criteria do I use? I really wouldn't say that I'm in a stage of using criteria for what to include in certain groups. Anyway, so yeah, the occasion hasn't come up that I've needed to get that granular. So that's my answer. I don't know. Maybe it's not a good answer, but you're welcome to tell me what I should consider if you have an idea. Okay. All right, Sal, what do you got for us here?
Is my diagram? There it is. I showed Dr. Dan this. I said, look, here's you can see the overlap of genes that we have. So we have some genes that we only share with chickens, but not with mice.
Right.
And we also have genes we share only with zebrafish, but not with chickens. I said, I was thinking, I got him. And he said, that's incomplete lineage sorting.
Okay, what does that mean? What does that mean, incomplete lineage sorting?
Let me unshare my screen. Okay, so they're going to throw this at you a lot. And I'm just like, dang, did you have to put that on the table? The thing is, okay, have you heard of Brandolini's law? Okay, incomplete.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
This is the thing you hate in a debate, they're going to use Brandolini's law. They'll throw something at you that it's like, if I had 40 times more time, I could probably refute you on that, but I just can't do it in 20 seconds. And so incomplete lineage sorting falls in that category. Just saying. Okay, so what it is the idea is that our common ancestor had all these tons of genes. Just, I'll throw out a figure, millions of genes. And then what happened is, well, some of them got saved within the chicken and the human, but didn't get saved in the mouse lineage. And that's how come we have genes that are only shared with chickens. And this is a big problem, because people start to say, well, to have this incomplete lineage sorter, you're going to have, to also explain orphan genes, you're going to have genomes that are just ginormous, ridiculously. All right, but he'll throw that at you, and it's like, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, and no one's actually done a study to say how ridiculous that could be. But I was just throwing it out just to make life hard on him. And I threw out, so this parallels what you said. The phylogenetic trees are a mess. So how do you make a phylogenetic tree, and you realize, hey, I'm doing this gene, and it's in humans and in chickens, but it's absent in mice. I can't fit my mouse. I can't fit my mouse into that phylogenetic tree because he doesn't have that. or
Yeah, and I can give you at least one example off the top of my head. Sal, are you familiar with the guy who thinks that a chimp and a pig must have mated to produce the human lineage? Okay.
No.
Now, this is a real evolutionist, but he has a good reason for thinking this. Of course, I think he's wrong. The explanation is we didn't share a common ancestor. But this will be one point of evidence against this idea of incomplete lineage sorting or whatever. Okay. So, did you know that we share so many genes with pigs that other apes don't share? Okay. Now, that's a problem, because where the pigs split off is, I mean, the group that eventually became pigs split off way before, so split off a long time ago. And so with those genes, we should, like, in our ape lineage, if we came from, ape-like ancestors, then those apes don't have those genes that the pigs have, okay, that we share with the pigs. Now, so then you've got to explain, if we came from that ape lineage, how did we get those genes back? Because the apes, that ape-like lineage didn't have them. Right? But
incomplete lineage sorting.
Okay, wait. I guess let me contradict myself, because I guess they could still pull the same trick and say, well, the ape-like ancestor had the gene, but we don't have that ape-like ancestor. We can't test the genetics of that ape-like ancestor. So maybe the ones that are still alive today don't have it, but maybe that ape-like ancestor had those pig genes. Okay. So, but I mean, when you start doing that, are we really talking about a scientific theory, or are they just doing what we do? Creationists, we say, okay, God created it that way. And if they say, oh, well, incomplete lineage sorting. Okay, well, that's your explanation for your story. But I have a different explanation for my story. But all we have to look at is the scientific evidence. So what does the evidence say? Don't appeal to your story. You can make up a word, but it doesn't mean your word is scientific. Go ahead.
That reminded me of something I was just dying to tell you. So I was in this month-long conference, Evolution 2025. It's a month-long conference, like 1,000 evolutionary biologists. I got to speak. By the way, they sent me a letter. They said, thank you for your presentation and sharing your expertise with me. So they sent me a
nice.
Welcome. Yeah. They had a session there called storytelling. And I was just laughing. They're trying to teach people how to tell stories better. And like, I just about choked laughing. I said, well, we have to be more effective in the idea was we have to be more effective in communication. And I happened to have the official program, and the official program had an entire session on storytelling, like a whole afternoon. We'll learn how to tell stories better. And I was just laughing. I said, how apropos. And I really don't want to diss my hosts. I have to be a lot better behavior and not, diss other evolutionary biologists as much as I'd like to, because, now I have to be kind of gentlemanly. But maybe I'll break the rules here and say that was really kind of funny. They had a whole session on storytelling to be more effective as a storyteller.
Wow. Well, I think they're doing pretty well at the storytelling. So, but that's interesting. That's really funny. Okay. Yeah, I was curious to ask you more about that conference, Sal. And let me just remind people, if you have your evidence for evolution or against evolution that you want to share, the link is at the top of the chat or in the description of this video if you want to join and share your evidence for or against evolution. It's not just me and Sal's show. Anybody can join. But Sal, why don't you tell me more about your experience at that conference?
Okay. 2 evolutionary biologists came up to me afterward. I've known them beforehand. They said that was an outstanding presentation. Now, they will not be named. They're outstanding. They are ID proponents. One of them got converted from evolution to creationism. The other, I don't know his whole story. But I actually I met him first at an ID conference, and then I was just randomly Googling around on population genetics. I said, this is the best paper ever written on this topic. And I realized, I know that author. Like, he's one of us. I know personally 6 people that are evolutionary biologists or who've taught evolution or published in evolution that are ID proponents and creationists. All of them have different stories. Some of them enter the field, they start out like a typical evolutionist and, just not caring about anything spiritual. And then in the course of their studies, they changed their mind. So one who is public she was on your channel. She's the cellular biologist, the blonde. And she said, I wasn't going into this thinking, I had no spiritual interest. And then I started to think, only there's a designer. So there's still a lot of them that are stuck. They're like, I trained for this and I've been disillusioned. So I'm like, then I was really glad I came to that conference. I said, I know there are probably more that are probably sympathetic to this viewpoint than they're letting on to. And they might be so glad that someone appears and is being a little bit bold to say things that they probably would feel uncomfortable sharing, but that they suspect it. So today, I took a tally of known creationists or ID proponents who are or were evolutionary biologists. Kurt Wise, young Earth creationist, studied at Harvard. That's one. Richard Buggs, professor of evolutionary biology. He's been criticized as being a creationist professor of evolutionary biology. So these are guys in the wide open. John Alquist. He did the whole chimp genome sequencing advocacy. Now he's a young Earth creationist. John Alquist. Todd Wood, known always. John Sanford. Richard von Sternberg. He was axed from the Smithsonian after he admitted an ID paper. He wasn't even an ID proponent. But he was saying, look, the guys are asking, Stephen Meyer's bringing up some good points. Let him, I'm going to pass his paper. So that's an evolutionary, double PhD. Another one's Gunter Beckley. And there is, depending on how we interpret this, George R. Price, not George McCready Price, George R. Price. One of the top evolutionary biologists, wrote on population genetics and evolutionary biology. He became a creationist. He had to apologize to his boss and said, look, my conscience won't let me release this paper. Can we just reword it a little bit? And that was George R. Price. So I'm trying to say, look, maybe we have to rethink. Let's not be assailing all this. There are probably people there who have maybe soft hearts and they can be persuaded. And you might not know that you have way more supporters out there than you think. And so that was probably the most positive experience I got. I could almost sense that there are people who are like, hey, we know Sal's saying things that we've questioned ourselves, but he's been the only one willing to stick his face on these questions. And Sternberg said the same thing. They know that the ID proponents are bringing up really difficult points that we can't resolve, but we just can't admit it publicly. So that was the best part of the experience. I just repeated stuff that has been kind of quietly in literature. I didn't bring anything too much original, but I was connecting the dots. And I'm like, look, your guys have said this. You're just ignoring it because it's an uncomfortable truth. So that was basically it. I could go into specifics.
Yeah. No, and actually Wesley is agreeing with you that there are people involved in this. He says, I gave one of my bio friends the Rob Stadler book, Stairway to Life, and they agreed with the points and gave it to their instructor who agreed. So many are sympathetic as well. Yeah, it's
Change Stand, that's another one.
And now finally Travis is getting off the God stuff. Well, no, I guess I didn't read the entire comment, but I thought I was going to get a science comment from Travis, but he says, I just don't understand why we're incredulous to slow changes, but not incredulous to fast magical changes from an already smart magical creator. I'm incredulous to the types of things that we know are done by intelligent actors being attributed to natural processes, which are incapable of doing those things. That's what I'm incredulous about. So, and actually that brings me to someone else's comment who said, hold on. They wanted to ask, so Philip said, Rebekah, what would you consider to be convincing evidence for evolution? I'll tell you where I think evolution is really the biggest lack is that there is currently no mechanism capable of producing organs and systems, features that we see in life. What we see in life are integrated systems. So systems that require many parts functioning together at once. And when we're talking about life, whether it be plants, animals, even bacteria, we're talking about very integrated systems that are working harmoniously, thousands of parts working harmoniously together to cause that animal to function. And so, it's incredible to try to think about that coming about by natural processes, by a blind process. Nature can only select from what's already available. So this cannot be attributed to natural selection. Evolution lacks a mechanism. So what would I consider as evidence for evolution? A mechanism that can produce genes, that can produce organs, that can produce systems, that can produce an integrated system. What is the mechanism? So that's what I would consider evidence for evolution. And then, there's a lot of things that could be considered as small pieces of evidence for evolution. We could talk about the fossil record. I think the fossil record, although there's some problematic things for young Earth creation in the fossil record, it's also extremely problematic for evolution. So, I would say that's a big problem. We would need to see millions of transitional forms. Since we have billions of fossils, or at least a billion, maybe more fossils, why can we only pick out, I've seen a couple of transitional forms, supposedly transitional forms. There should be millions. So it should be more transitional forms than complete creatures like we see on Earth today. Go ahead, Sal.
I didn't want to interrupt I just had a point to add about transitionals.
Okay.
If you want to.
Yeah. Go for it.
Well, the problem in transitionals now is no longer the fossil record. I'll even grant that they're transitionals in the fossil record. I'll be even like a common descentist like Michael Behe and grant that. The problem is you have these, first off, you have what they call orphan genes that are unique to each creature. There's no similarity. It's like, well, one solution is you have this, this ancestor that had all these genes, and then you have incomplete lineage sorting. And you realize that thing will have to have a bazillion genes to carry all the genes in all creatures. That's not going to work. So incomplete lineage sorting will not. So how can you build a phylogenetic tree for proteins that only exist in one creature? And we probably, the human could have 1,000 of these things. So what do you do about that? What do you do about all the features that just like pop up? Okay, so that's one. And then it's not just like individuals, you have entire groups. So like the metazoans have collagen, and then the primates have, I think other eukaryotes have zinc fingers. And I showed the zinc finger collagen in my talk at Evolution 2025. And I showed the collagen on one, zinc finger on the other. And I've showed this to Dr. Dan, and I said, does that have a common ancestor? After 4 years, he finally said, no, there's no common ancestor for all proteins. So that means there's no transitional for these very important proteins. If you didn't have collagen's like 25% of the human protein weight. You'd be dead. You'd be worse than a jellyfish. I mean, assuming you're even alive, because collagen is necessary for bone and skin. That's pretty important. Okay. So it's like, he finally had to concede, there's no transitional, there's no common ancestor for all these. To which I'll say, okay, well, where did they come from? And he said, well, look, proteins pop up all the time, Sal. You have to admit that. And it was like, I'm not ready to concede that, but okay. Pop up, I like that, like boom, I could accept that if I were a progressive creationist. I said, okay, that's more acceptable, but you're having to invoke miracles. He said, well, you haven't worked out the math. I'm just like, look, do I really have to? You're the guys that have to work out the math to prove this is feasible, and so so I'm just giving you one. The nested hierarchy will fail for orphan genes because you only have one creature. If you're dealing with an orphan gene, or you might have only one group and you can't tie it all the way back to like the bacteria. Your nested hierarchy will just have to just start with this ancestor that never, just sort of popped out of nowhere. So what do you do about that? And then the difficulty, these things are so complex that if a lot of them are all or nothing complexity. If you knock out parts of the system, it's dead. You've got to have all the critical parts there. It's just not quite as severe as a password, but it's more like a car. You can identify critical pieces that have to be there, and if they're not, it just doesn't work. It doesn't make sense to have an intermediate. And Dr. Dan agreed with me. You're not going to have a transitional between these. I'm just like, look, so that's macroevolution. I gave you an example that there's no common ancestor. Even you agreed. And his only counter was they just pop up all the time. I'm like, okay, you could qualify as a progressive creationist at that point. They just pop up all the time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and it's like I lost my train of thought, but yeah, it's evolution. So many problems, so little time. How do we talk about all the problems with this? Look, even I'm choosing humans because we're most familiar with humans, but I would like people to think about this for a minute. Think about what happens every time you take a breath. Think about how this system in your body allows you to take in a breath, that oxygen gets paired with your blood, that your heart pumps the blood to blood vessels that go all over your body. And then it's not just that they're going through, there's also a system in place so that the blood, the nutrients from the blood can get passed to the cells in your body. And those cells are able, they know exactly what needs to be brought in and what doesn't need to be brought in. They bring in the stuff they need and they process it And that's how you're staying alive. Think about all that needs to be in place. Your brain has to be attached to it. You've got your kidneys that are cleaning your blood. You've got so many systems that are in place, and every one of them so complex down to the cellular level. And this somehow, you think this came about by stages over millions of years? That doesn't make any sense. Everywhere we look, as far down in the fossil record as we go, we see organisms that are complete, that are able, they have different forms, but they're all capable of getting nutrients to themselves, of processing, of having a metabolism and living. And we see that throughout. Now, there's one of those evolutionary buzzwords that's tries to patch a major problem. Okay. You'll hear the word exaptation. It's the idea that, well, that's no problem. You see, every transition that happens, it had a function. So just think about that for a minute. What you're saying is that your heart, in all its stages of development, it had a purpose. Okay. And then all of a sudden, the purpose suddenly became it's going to pump blood all over your body. What are you doing when what were the blood vessels doing for millions of years as they were developing? Where was the blood? What was the blood? How was blood forming over millions of years? What was it doing before it's doing what it's doing now? Do you know how complex blood is? And so you then even your lungs, your heart, your brain, how was all of this having functions at every level? Now, that is just, guys, it's ridiculous. Just think about it. There's no step-by-step process that could produce these integrated systems by natural processes. Did you want to share something, Sal? Should I put this up?
I don't want to interrupt your train of thought, but I mean, just for the record, in case anyone was questioning, this was actually, I presented this at Evolution 2025. And even Dr. Dan, who's Mr. Nested Hierarchy, had to concede this. I said, okay, what's the common ancestor of these two proteins? Okay, so the protein on the left is collagen. And you can use any English alphabetic letters to represent the amino acids in collagen or any protein. It's called the FASTA representation. And so like the amino acid glycine is represented by a G. So on the left, I highlighted the G amino acids. Now you can see this is a non-random pattern. That is so blatantly obvious. By the way, the reason that's important, you can see the collagen up here. It looks kind of like it's loopy. It's a bunch of loops. That periodic G helps it loop. That's important for it to loop. Whereas a different protein on the right is the zinc finger 136 in humans. There I highlighted the C's and the H's. C is for cysteine, H for histidine. That's where the zinc ion parks. There's no way. See, there's no transitional, no common ancestor. 40 years ago, we wouldn't be able to make this argument. I wouldn't have Dr. Dan saying, yeah, there's no common ancestor for all proteins. But today, because we're able to do gene sequencing and we have all this biotechnology, we can now say, look, there's no transitional. Even he will admit it. So it's like, okay, now you've got a problem, because you can be claiming all the transitionals in the fossil record you want, but you don't have transitionals for the proteins that are so life critical. Now you're really stuck. And even, all these evolutionary biologists say, oh, that's no problem for evolution. I'm just like, yeah, right.
Yeah, and there are minimum numbers of these structures that life can function with, right? Like, we've tried knocking genes out of organisms to see how few can they live with, how few proteins can they live with. And they require a lot. Even simple one-celled organisms require a lot of different proteins. And those proteins are thousands of genes. I mean, not thousands of genes, thousands of base pairs, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, the point is, even if, okay, so like if you have a very complex password, you can't knock out the pieces, even though they can prove that they're simpler ones. And same for any mechanical system, like a complex car that might have a lot of complex things. Yeah, there might be cars out there that can operate with a lot less. It doesn't mean that those parts are inessential in a complex car, because you start to pull wires in the right spots, it's gone. So the analogy I like is a Rube Goldberg machine. You have simple ones and you have really complex ones. And that's why I kind of don't like the word irreducible complexity, because you could have some things that you can make smaller, but even the ones that are, nice and big and complicated, you still need all the parts. You still need all the parts. Otherwise the thing dies. And that would be the case for humans. So we have arguments today that didn't exist when I started at this, even only 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. This is how fast the data is falling in our favor. And then I'm seeing it at these evolution conferences. They're people, these people aren't stupid. They start to ask the same questions that Richard Sternberg and others, like, something's not adding up,
Right. I know. DBK says, Rebekah, all those questions have been long addressed and transitions demonstrated. No. DBK, no.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't be so dismissive.
No, it's not true though. And if you disagree, then bring the evidence. I would love to see that, because no. What I've noticed is that the questions, how have they been answered? The questions have been answered with storytelling. What we were talking about earlier, storytelling. So storytelling does not count as evidence. Cellular says, keep following that system back in time and you will get single-celled organisms. No, you won't, because it takes something special to make an organ or a system within life. Do you know photosynthesis is so complex, we haven't even completely figured it out yet. But what we know is, if that solar panel on your roof, plants are very similar to that in leaves, in the capabilities of leaves, except they have more capabilities than your solar panel. And leaves work at incredibly efficient ways of capturing energy. So much more efficient than your solar panel. But would you ever say your solar panel isn't designed?
May I comment?
Yeah.
I thought you saw a comment that said, there are transitionals or not. What was that earlier one? By
it
DBK?
Was the transitions have been demonstrated.
This is right after I showed where there are no transitionals in the proteins between collagen and zinc finger, and we have Dr. Dan himself. I finally got him on video to admit. I'm sorry. He's now.
And I'm sure, Sal, it's just funny because you will never let him.
I'm never going to let him.
I mean, it's like that comment, that one comment is brought up every single time you talk about it. Which, that's fine, but it's just.
No, you don't know how hard I worked to get him to admit the truth. And I got to credit him. He knew that he wasn't going to win that. And he knew he was going to be bludgeoned if he denied it. So we had a very difficult agreement there. But now he's very popular in creationist and ID circles because I feature him in almost all of my talks with that comment. So I just wanted to respond to DBK. You could say the transitionals have been all found, but I have shown you right here, and then you could look up, Dr. Dan will agree with me. There's no common ancestor for these things. There's no transitional. It just kind of like popped into existence.
Okay, there's a lot of comments that are coming up. DBK says, Rebekah, the simplest cells we have today need a minimum of around 250 to 400 proteins to live, but we can certainly conceive of and even build simpler cells that use less, but are not as able to compete. We cannot build. We have not built. And so go ahead, Sal.
Okay, so change 10, by the way, she was on the evolutionist side, atheist. She was on examining origins. She gave her story. She had studied the Cynthia cell. The goal of the Cynthia cell was to make the minimum possible cell. So they knocked everything out that they could possibly knock out. And they said, well, this is dead. Let's put this one back in. And so this is how they built this cell. And by the way, this is a cell that needs to be fed by food made by much more complicated creatures because it can't synthesize all the nutrients it needs on its own. So, you're already kind of rigging the game here where you're counting on other creatures to provide the nutrients. You have something basically on life support that it has to use chemicals that it can't synthesize itself. So that number, to say you could build one that's simpler, it's like, well, that's falsified by the attempt that they have tried. Furthermore, Rob Stadler pointed this out. Also, other physicists have said, and people that studied the matter, they said this is like, we did an examination of what you would really need, and it's about that number.
Yeah, well, anyway, even if we could, let's conceive of a simpler cell. Let's conceive of a cell that only needs 5 proteins. Now, calculations have been done on the probability of a single protein arising by chance, by natural processes. And that is very improbable, and to the degree of almost, the number of atoms in the universe. If you could get one atom in the universe, that's the probability of one protein coming about by natural processes, by chemical processes. So how do you get, even if you had a cell that only needed 5, how astronomically absurd is it to think about that, like the probability of that coming about by natural processes? In fact, that was where's the paper I had from yesterday? I guess I already put it away. I mean, last week, the paper that evolutionary biology is dead in Darwin's warm little pond. That was exactly what it was calculating. It was calculating the minimum possible, considering the co-origination problem, meaning just one enzyme is not enough by itself to get anything done or to be selected for fitness, because by itself it doesn't do anything. So it needs these other processes. So it's very difficult.
I wanted to share that some of those numbers were worked out by an atheist. I suddenly tried to get to my bookshelf here.
Oh, really?
Fred Hoyle was among the first.
Oh, now, wow. Cool.
So his alternative was space aliens, but that kind of just moves the problem elsewhere, because he had some religious, he was anti-religious. He said, okay, I'll pick something else aside from God being the solution. So you named 5 proteins. You covered one of the proteins. You can name one that's probably really essential.
Oh, a helicase, topoisomerase.
Topoisomerase. 1,531 amino acids for the human version. But let's say you only needed 10% of the topoisomerase amino acids. That would still be 150 amino acids that are critical. This is like having a password. Remember, I showed the amino acids can be like English alphabet, represent English alphabet. So imagine a password that's 150. You got to get everyone right. So I'm being generous here. I'm not even insisting you got to get all 1,500. Just how about 150? Because we do know some of those are really, really critical, like the ATPase domain and the Mg metal binding domain and DNA domain. And if you don't have that, you don't have a topoisomerase. So sometimes, what would it take before you think this can't really happen naturally?
Yeah, well, some people are realizing that, like you said. And so Lara says, where's the beef? Eat more chicken. Hey, I would settle for some evolutionary chicken. If you can't give me the beef, give me the evolutionary chicken. Iron Charioteer actually brings up something really interesting here. He says endosymbiosis is the best explanation for evolution. Now, and as well as ERVs. Okay, so this is actually an argument that some evolution believers are making. In fact, the lady, I can't remember her name, but she wrote the book Acquiring Genomes. She won a Nobel Prize.
Lynn Margulies?
Yes, thank you.
She didn't win a Nobel Prize, I don't think.
What? No, I think she did. Okay, but I'll look her up. I've got her, but if I could just step away for a minute.
Behe loves Lynn Margulies, by the way. Quotes her all the time. Interesting.
She fully admits, look, mutation plus natural selection cannot produce diversity of life. This is her explanation. Endosymbiosis, and basically, what's the other word? Symbiogenesis. Basically, organisms combining their genes or actually combining together to form new organisms. Now, I think that's a much more reasonable explanation for evolution than the modern synthesis. So, but the problem I still see with that is that if you're talking about two organisms with genes combining to make a different organism, you've still got the gene origination problem. So there's only so many organisms. You've got to get the genes to come from somewhere. So we still don't have a gene building mechanism. And we still see, like Sal said, orphan genes in tons of organisms. So where's the gene building mechanism? Go ahead, Sal.
I do want to say regarding orphan genes, I mentioned a creationist who also teaches evolutionary biology, Richard Buggs. He wrote on orphan genes. He said, this is not getting any attention from the evolutionary community. And he said, I think the reason is we don't study it is the problem's unsolvable. And so what ends up happening is the evolutionist literature will focus on stuff that they think they can figure out. And a lot of times they will figure out these little minuscule things, totally avoid the big problems. And this is confirmation bias. They just don't deal with the problems that would actually overturn their theory. It's kind of reassuring just to think, I'm just going to read the data that makes me comfortable. And I'm not saying that that's dishonest, but if they're willing to focus on the areas that are difficult, they might see things different. And Richard Buggs was saying, look, it's surprising people aren't studying this, but I think the reason they aren't is they have no explanation for it. And it just, people are going to say, well, where did all this come from? Where did these problems come from?
Yep. Now, DBK says that a prospective complaint isn't evidence either. So the idea of a problem was addressed with the idea of an answer. Let's not hold different standards or move goalposts. DBK, my main complaint, though, is that when problems are resolved with storytelling, that is not science. And I'm fine with people believing things that are not scientific. I'm fine with people believing the evolutionary story and storytelling to fit in the data with their model. But what I'm not fine with is that storytelling being presented as if it's science. And that is what is happening right now. Look, I believe a story. I believe in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I think there's good scientific evidence for that story. But I understand that at the very basis, there's a story I believe. And so what I see with evolution is that there's no admission that the basis of this is a story. Okay, so let's look at the evidence. Now, it's fine if they want to, they've addressed the problem with a story, but that does not suffice as evidence. So that's my problem. When I say, okay, well, the creator made it that way, then I'm recognizing I'm telling a story about the way the creator did it, right? I'm not supplying that as evidence as if it's scientific evidence.
I have something to imitate an evolutionist.
Okay, go for it.
Antibiotic resistance. You can't deny that natural selection is changing and improving that bacteria. That's evolution. That's a proof that evolution happens right before our eyes.
Well, and that's the kind of evolution that I agree with. So I never said that I don't agree with change within organisms. If that's what you mean by evolution, I already agree with that. So that, to me, when I say evolution, I'm talking about chemical processes bringing about life and the diversity of life. So that's what I'm talking about. Now, antibiotic resistance is a good example of how God made things so fantastically that they are able to adapt to their environments. And that's from what's already present within them, that they have ways. And we've seen that bacteria and it have ways of sharing genetic information to help each other fight. And they're able to purposely mutate themselves in order to fight antibiotics. So to me, these are more clues of the design that's already present in bacteria for survival. So what do you say to that, Sal?
I actually didn't have a counter to that until about last year. I'm not kidding. Oh, maybe the last few years.
Uh-huh.
The thing, and I'm so glad you studied topoisomerase. I'm so glad. Because I looked at one study of antibiotic resistance. And I don't know how I found this by providence. And it said, okay, we figured out how this thing got antibiotic resistance. It was one particular creature. And I wrote Joe DeWeese. I said, this is amazing. It said, well, it mutated a certain section of the topoisomerase and it gave it a name. And then it developed resistance. And I was saying, Joe, but it's still a topoisomerase at the end of the day. What is not happening? So the reason this was important to me, we can really argue. I mean, we have the brain power and the education because we have so many ID proponents that have studied topoisomerase at this point, and they are recognized in the field. So you're not going to assail them. In fact, I know, by the way, when you hear that they're good arguments that the evolutionists aren't addressing, keep throwing it in their face because they know they don't want to talk about it. They'll talk about things where they sense you have a weakness. They do not talk about the topoisomerase. I just thought I'd let you know that. Just a data point. Keep hammering them on that. Because the reason this was compelling, you were saying it's still about, the creationists would say, well, look, it evolved antibiotic resistance, but it's still a bacteria. It's still an E. coli. It's like, well, that's kind of an okay argument. I'd like something a little stronger. So this one where it's still a topoisomerase, it's like, look, you're not going to change it to be anything else except the topoisomerase, because if you do, what's going to happen? The creature's going to die because it needs topoisomerase. So I was providentially shown, it's like, look, we're now beginning to have defined limits of how much change can be. I can now argue that very forcefully. I said, if this is true of the topoisomerase, it's going to be true of so many other things. There might be things you can knock out, you could change, but there's going to be a point you cannot compromise anymore. And it's not going to be mutable anymore. The variability is not unlimited.
Yeah. And I mean, with antibiotic resistance, the conversation is actually bigger because there are different ways that antibiotic resistance happens. Like you mentioned this topoisomerase, but then, there are just like, okay, a mutation that might occur that we don't know if it was a mutation that just happened by natural processes or if it was an intentional mutation by the organism, because bacteria have been shown to be able to do that, to intentionally bring about mutations. So, I
will add one more. I mean, seriously, this has bothered me a long time until I began to study the matter. Mm-hmm. So what often happens in evolutionary biology, they're cherry picking the data. Maybe not. I really don't think it's intentional, but some of them will start to realize, oh, we weren't considering. So sometimes, like in the case of like pesticide resistance, they're saying, hey, look, the thing evolved pesticide resistance, or the bacteria evolved antibiotic resistance. What ended up happening, they found out, well, it had dysfunctional pumps. So the poisons didn't get in their body as quickly because a normal creature would have this. And then so as we started to do more studies, it's like, okay, let's put this thing in different environments. And we realized to be adapted in one environment made it maladaptive in so many others. It got, so we often see this, to become specialized in one thing, you have to be less general. You have to give up a lot of stuff. And this is exactly what's happening. They gave the impression all you have to do is just keep subjecting bacteria to different environments. It's going to just like acquiring more tool sets or acquiring, just more things. And that's not the case. It actually loses a lot. And then if you put it in back in the old environment, it dies. And this is not really covered. So I didn't really realize this until 4 years ago. I mean, I was kind of in my own little specialty of, the stuff that I was assigned. So the antibiotic resistance thing, I didn't have a good counter for. So I'm just sharing it with you.
Well, yeah. And what I wanted to tell you, Sal, it was really interesting because someone brought to me as a piece of evidence for evolution, they brought up that something evolved the ability to digest nylonase, which is a man-made material. And so I actually was like, let me look this up. Nylonase, evolution. I looked it up, and guess what I found? A paper with Sal Cordova's name on it. And it was you, and I think it was you and John Sanford, right? That actually went and studied that and found out it wasn't that it had evolved a new ability. It was, go ahead.
Okay, let me fill you in on this.
Okay.
And I have been at the National Institutes of Health. I asked my professor, who's a professional evolutionary biologist, I gave him the data. In 1 minute, he said, you're right. Yet my fellow students were thinking, okay, so the story goes, nylon wasn't invented until about 1935. And then come around 1976, we have bacteria that seem to be able to digest all sorts of nylon, like it had to evolve. And everyone's believing, so since nylon didn't exist until 1935, there's no way it had that capability to digest nylon beforehand. So we broke that story apart. The first thing is, it turns out humans have the ability to do the same. We can't eat nylon. I mean, we can't live off of it, but we have the enzyme trypsin, which will break it apart. And then we had evolutionary biologists say, look at all these creatures that are all over the world that couldn't possibly have evolved this. And we call it, it's ancient because it's a conserved feature. Nylon's very similar to the amino acid lysine. We went through all the biochemistry. And I want to close out this story a little bit because this will tell you about the evolutionary industry. We submitted the paper for the last 8 years, got rejected. The editors told us, your conclusions are right, but they gave some excuse why they're not going to publish it. They said, sorry, maybe you could find another journal. We're just not interested, but your conclusions are right. Publicly on Swami Das's website, he was trying to curry favor with John Sanford. He got an editor from Cell, Steve Matheson, and he looked at the paper. He said, yeah, your paper sucks, but your conclusion's right. But by the way, I'm not going to help. You're not going to publish in my journal. But he said, your conclusion's right. What's really funny is they're all saying we were right, that this story's been made up. There is a whole web page that the National Center for NCSE, National Center for Science Education. I'm sorry. Our joke is it's selling evolution. But anyway, in 1986 or so, they said, new proteins without God's help. And they used this nylonase evolution. And now it's been falsified. They've not retracted that and said, an addendum, Sal Cordova and John Sanford figured this was false. By the way, even other evolutionary biologists know it's false. But to this day, when evolutionary biologists are talking about how do new proteins evolve, they cite this erroneous paper by Ono in 1984. We can't publish the truth. Some of the publishers, the editors, know the truth, but they won't publish it. And then there are these other researchers and editors that don't know the truth, and they just go on their merry way. That's the state of affairs. So
okay, so it never got published?
No, we did. We finally got an editor who's interested after 8 years and 7 rejections.
Okay, so it still might be published formally?
Yes.
Okay, because I mean, I found it online and I didn't, so at least it's available online to people.
And I shared this on Erica's channel when we were particularly good. We were still tight. I don't know how she feels about me now. She's still nice, and she showed up on your channel, greeted me nicely. She received it and said, "Well done, Sal. Well done, Sal." So Erica Gutsick Given didn't have anything negative to say about it. She let me share it on her channel. She said, "Oh, Sal's my favorite creationist, and we're going to talk about phylogenetics today." And she was so happy because I was the first creationist could make those nested hierarchies using automated tools.
Cool. Howdy, Yanni. I'm just now getting to these comments because I've been very involved in this conversation with Sal. So, okay, DBK has a lot of comments here. We'll try to get to some of these, but I'm going to scroll down and see what else is going on. Okay, DBK wanted to respond to what we said earlier. By seen, I mean we allowed it to self-assemble and watch it. Not we built, but also not we found. I'm going to need a bigger explanation on that because I really have no idea what you're talking about because I don't think we've seen anything self-assemble like that. So Tom says, with all the scientists and laboratory equipment, scientists can't even come close to making a simple cell. And we are supposed to believe it happened by accident. Thank you, Tom. Yes, exactly. So DBK says, I think you're making science better by challenging it. There's always storytelling to bridge data and ideas, but science should minimize the storytelling and maximize the evidence. Thank you. Yep. And so let's see. Guys, people are welcome to come on here and talk because it's really hard to get through everybody's comments. But thank you for making all these comments. So Tom says a small number of bacteria have the resistance already. They never evolved the resistance. Thank you. And then some bacteria they will transfer genetic information to other bacteria. So I find that really fascinating that bacteria have the capability to do that. So that's really cool, but it has nothing to do with evolution, right? So Cellular says, so the biology books are all wrong. Reminds me of that song, Don't Know Much About History. Don't know much about a science book. So yeah, actually, I am really sorry to say it, but I do think the biology books are wrong. And this has been demonstrated. In fact, a lot of people have written books on this. If you read Jonathan Wells' book, Zombie Science, he talks about how known false things are still taught in books at all levels, including college level. College level biology books will teach things about evolution that are already known to be false. And even though this has been pointed out, and even though people will admit, yeah, okay, we know this has been, falsified, yet how does it still keep making it into the books? Why do we still see in books at all education levels about the primordial soup bringing about the origin of life? Why is that there? Why are we still saying that, even though every scientific observation we make about life shows that non-life does not turn into life? That's actually what science shows. But sorry to say, yes, biology books are often filled with absolute nonsense. So let me try to go back to some of the other comments. Okay, DBK says that we have examples of creatures with simpler bloods and simpler hearts that are little more than water and capillary vessels. there's no such thing as there are systems that are less complex than a human circulatory system, but does that make them able to evolve by natural processes? Every circulatory system, if you look at, and in fact, I could pull it up if we have time and if we want to go that direction. But if you look at the circulatory systems of simple animal, like creatures that we would call simple, their circulatory systems are still fantastically complex. And so I think it's, it's hard to explain by natural processes, no matter how simple it is. Go ahead, Sal.
I wanted to interject a comment. I was in a debate, and I thought I was beating the guy up pretty good. And I really did want to tell him he finally came up with a good point. And that was Eric Planet Peterson. I was modern day debate. And he said, well, look, don't you admit that there's a progression there? I said, absolutely. So you have really simple bacteria, you have more complex, and then you have the eukaryotes, and you kind of build your way up. And he said, don't you see, doesn't that look evolutionary? And I would say, actually, I think that's a design feature. We would not have been able to figure out the genetic code as easily as we did if we didn't have a simple creature like bacteria. I mean, to do the experiments that Marshall Nierenberg did, he won the Nobel Prize to figure out the genetic code. You could look up, it was incredible. But I'm like, how would you do that to a human? He could play around with the bacteria. It was so easy to do it. And so you do see a progression of simple forms, like the eyes of creatures with simplified eyes compared to the more complex eyes. You do see a progression. If you look at all the creatures, you can line them up and say, I actually think that's a design feature to make it easier for us to understand our own biology. If we didn't have those, what the alternative would be.
But Val, I want to challenge one word that you're using, and that is progression, because that makes it sound as if they started out simple and got more and more complex, right? So I think we see group, like, yes, we see
new word.
Let's find out what word is a better way to say that. There's not a progression, but I
think we're going to have to think hard, because I have to make a presentation. I might have to say that word. And I mean, I agree with you. If anyone can figure out a better word to describe that, you could arrange this. Because when I teach this, I'll say, look, I'm not going to deny. You could line up all these creatures. I could say, this is simple, more complex. The organ in this creature is not as complex as the one in this creature. And I don't know how you describe that. It's like...
Yeah, well, I mean, do you think the reason that you're tempted to use the word progression is because of the evolutionary indoctrination that we all go through of thinking of it as a progression?
No, it's more like the way that we learn. You don't teach an engineer how to build a rocket ship. You have to teach him how to make small things first.
Yeah, but but you can say there are simple organisms. There are more simple organisms, and there are more complex organisms.
It's like, okay, there is this ID theory, and I'm going to credit Paul Nelson and Bill Dembski. We call it organisms as oracles. They are our teachers to learn about our own biology. And so we're like progressing through, grade school to college, all the way to graduate school. The human biology is the most complicated. And you have the bacteria that's simple. We learn so much about life. We learn molecular biology, DNA, transcription, and translation. We learn about all these things like topoisomerase and bacteria and then yeast. So I don't know what the word is, because you do progress through learning in stages. Even though progression is evolutionary, I'd say, it is. I use the word conceptual progression. When you can find a better word, I would be incredibly grateful, because.
Okay, I'll think about it.
Okay, but I wanted to say that does look. I could see how someone could think that looks very evolutionary. You could, and even Darwin's writings, Origin of Species, Chapter 6, he said, look at the eye, how it progressed through history, and just like, well, he has a point. you know. So I just wanted to, okay, I gave you a quasi pro-evolution argument there, but it is a pattern we do see, simple to complex.
Now, Iron Charioteer says, do you think taxpayers should be paying for evolution to be taught in schools? I think it's fine to teach evolution as one possible idea about origins, but I think other ideas should be taught. Why are you laughing? Because this is the Kent Hovind thing? Is that why you're laughing?
I'll tell you what I think, because I was
What?
remember I said about all these biologists, evolutionary biologists or creationists? I said, look, the way we have to look at this is we have to make evolutionary biology great again. Let the truth be out. Let the creationists also teach their version of evolutionary biology, because if all evolution is, the definition is descent with heritable modification, even creationists could be classified as evolutionary biology, believing in some form of evolution. And I'm like, okay, maybe let's try this. Let's teach it like we would say, look, you could still believe in evolution and be a young earth creationist. And it just depends on your definition. This model of long ages, that's just the model. But if you accept descent with modification, even if you believe in God and that he works miracles, you're a creationist and an evolutionist. And we have made evolution great again. Sorry, that was a joke. That was a joke, definitely. I knew it would rub a lot of.
I want to address this because Top Dog and Morgan are making this talking about this issue. So Morgan is saying our reproductive system creates a human being right in front of our eyes. Open your eyes. Yes, it's amazing that our reproductive system is able to create a human being. And that is because of what it is already programmed to do. We already have everything that we need within our living system in order to be able to reproduce. That does not tell us how we came about having this ability. So it's a totally different thing. But people are constantly bringing this up. I'm trying to find where Top Dog wrote about this, but I can't find his comment anymore. But anyway, basically he says, like, do you deny? Oh, here it is. Denying evolution happens is like denying that you were an egg and sperm cells, baby, toddler, kid, and teenager. Do you think you've always been the way that you are? Not every population evolves the same way. Well, you're talking about changes that are already programmed to happen, and maybe programmed isn't the best word, but features that are already present in humanity. So that is totally different than saying that we came about by natural processes. Do you want to comment on this, Sal?
No. I'm sorry, that just seems such like confused reasoning. I don't feel like trying to pick it up. I'm sorry, Top Dog.
No, I know, but it's confused reasoning, but it is reasoning that a lot of people use. This is not the first time that I've heard this objection. So
I will say people conflate the act of maintaining something that works versus creating something that works. There's no question this works. That's not the issue. How did it come about from earlier, more either, other precursors, whatever they are with those creatures, like bacteria would be our ancestors. So, how did we go from a microbe to a human being? They'll say, oh, in small steps. Well, the problem is when you look at those steps, they're not so small.
Right. And it's a conflation of like or equivocation, I should say, equivocation on the idea of change. So like, right. Like, it's like,
right.
It's confusing the two different meanings of change, because one is change that naturally takes place. One is an assumption about life coming about by natural processes.
I just realized something. So as the child is developing, when you see the like Haeckel's embryos, it's, even though that was false, there is some similarity at that stage. And they're like, well, okay, then it just, they actually thought they tied evolution to, development, because you do. I'm seeing where maybe this is coming from, is that we just changed so radically in the process of going from the zygote all the way to full human. They think, okay, that's really easy to do then via evolution. But when we actually study the molecular details, that's where it's devastating. So I could see how people are confused. The other thing is, even though we look physically similar to chimpanzees, those orphan genes are going to be a nasty problem. So people that actually study proteins and genes that know that the gaps are a lot bigger than meets the eye. You can look at one little blob of a circly type thing and think, oh, that's a bacteria, and then look at another one. And they're so different when you look at the molecules. It's not that easy. So you will see the differences when you start looking at the amino acid sequences of the proteins. That's where you can actually apply probability. But I can understand that, a little zygote looks so different than the adult stage, so it must be easy to transform things. Now I'm starting to see where they're coming from, by the way.
Yeah, but it's easy to transform in that way because of what is already programmed in the not just the DNA, but also in whatever is being passed from mother to child and sperm. There's more that's passed than just the DNA, but you know what I mean, in what's been given with the egg at the beginning.
So I think before we started to know, Haeckel and all those people that were connecting, what do they call it? Phylogeny and ontology. Yeah. Ontology is the development from the little embryo to the human. They thought, okay, this is evidence it can happen easily, because obviously something that looked like a little tadpole became a human being. And then there were like things that did look like tadpoles and became frogs. They said, so it must be a very easy process. So that comment there kind of highlights kind of 19th century thinking before we had the molecular biology revolution. So I'm beginning to now see how come people could accept evolution so easily, because that's all they knew. That's all they had to go on. They don't have the modern 21st century knowledge that we have now. That was actually a really good comment, by the way, now that I'm reflecting on it.
Oh, cool. All right. Well, props to Top Dog then. Okay, this is interesting. Cellular says the phone started simple, just dots and dashes, like single cells within the telegram, to modern phones, Googleplexes of cells just in our lifetimes. But Cellular, what is the factor involved in making phones go from simple to complex? Intelligence, human beings working to make phones more complex. And I would argue that that is what is needed for the diversity of life, for simple life, for even simple life forms to very complex life forms. By the way, all of life is complex. So when I say simple, it's only a comparison of what's available, but every form of life is complex. But the thing that is needed is intelligence. So the phone didn't start out simple and then by natural processes become incredibly complex. It got there from a lot of human minds working together to make it more complex. And that is what we are saying when we look at the scientific observations of the world, when we look at the complexity of life, we see that there must be a designer. That is our conclusion from our scientific observations. We see complex integrated systems. Every complex integrated system, we know that it comes from an intelligent source. Therefore, that is how we get to the point where we say, look, we know that there was a designer of life, because we don't ever see these types of things coming about by natural processes. You would never believe that your phone came about by natural processes. Why? I don't think it's just because I know where phones came from. I already know humans make phones. No, I think if you went to Mars and you saw something complex like a phone, And you wouldn't say, oh, look, this just evolved here. You would know, hey, I guess there are Martians. I guess, or there was some kind of form of intelligence that left this here, that made this here. So anyway, do you want to comment on that, Sal?
There are people that believe in God-guided evolution. And honestly, even as a card-carrying young Earth creationist, I'll say if that's what you believe, I'm closer to you than you think. And that's all I have to say. So the other thing I wanted to say in my presentation, and I found this really funny among evolutionary biologists, you have a set of them that get really angry when you point out there's technology in biology. They really resent it when you point out that the eye is better designed than what they say. They prefer to say it's junky, because if it's actually well designed, you start to think there's got to be a designer. This didn't, it's too well. And so I pointed out examples. The bird's quantum magnetic compass. It's a quantum magnetic compass. If I showed you a picture of one where we tried to make a quantum compass, it's gigantic. We spent thousands, millions trying to build it. It's gigantic. But that little bird has that quantum magnetic compass. And the physicists, the ones that man makes, we have to cool down to like near absolute zero. The bird can do it in regular, ordinary temperatures. And the physicists said, look, this is at the limit of what can possibly be done. We can't build anything close to it. Marcos Eberlin said, gave me the citation. That's also true about photosynthesis, the exciton transport in photosynthesis. You create an electron and an electron hole, which is really advanced semiconductor physics. I saw this in a biochem book. I'm like, what's that doing there? That's advanced semiconductor physics. And it's in the biological system. And not only that, it's kicking our rear ends as far as we can't do that in the solar cell. We wish we knew how. And so
I know, and we are modeling our technology after life. So that doesn't make sense to think of life as something that came about by natural processes. Then how did it get so good that intelligent beings want to copy it? And these magical powers are credited to nature. If you notice, everywhere it's like, oh, nature made this for us. Nature did this for us. But nature has no will. Nature has no intention, unless there's unless you're saying that there's an intelligence in nature. If you're saying that, then I don't see how that's different than me saying God, right?
Right.
So anyway, I think that's a good stopping point, don't you, Sal?
We have too much fun at this. This is not good for us.
I know. Well, I've been sitting down too long. So yeah, but it's been great. Thank you guys for being along the ride with us.
I'm sorry that you'll be off for a month, but that'll probably be good for me too, because I have to prepare for my Discovery Institute. They begged me for 2 talks. I'll be releasing them. I could offer, if you ever want me to share my talks here.
Yeah, great.
You just let me know. By the way, I'm very grateful that you given me a platform to share my work and advertise it. So thank you.
Yeah. And so Sal, which channel are you using right now? Evidence and Reasons or Evidence and Reasons Academy?
Mostly Evidence Reasons Academy. You'll be bored to tears when you hear about all the stuff. That's why I put it there, because I can be my more nerd self and not care whether people understand or care what I have to say. I have an intern working for me. She's just wonderful. We're studying nuclear localization signals. I will be doing papers on statistical mechanics and biophysics. And I will share on my main channel my talk at the Discovery Institute. So even though it's a private meeting, because there are a lot of, even those evolutionary biologists, I can't give their names. Some of them might be there. I can share my talk to the public. And so Evidence and Reasons, go to the Evidence and Reasons for the Christian Faith video channel. That's a better representation of me. So thank you for advertising my work and being such a faithful supporter of my channel and my work. Much gratitude.
Of course. Thanks for coming on, and thanks for sharing all the great science. Take care, everyone. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back to do this again, well, God willing, next month. So take care. Thanks.